My name's Patrice Nagle. I work at Fisher Phillips, and we are an employment-only law firm. And we only counsel uh, and help employers. So we're an employer side law firm, and we really do everything. We help with all sorts of issues, be it vaccines or counseling, which is what this really has been, sort of preventative counseling, making sure that people know how they need to handle things. We also do litigation. We help employers with all sorts of issues: discrimination, harassment, retaliation, class actions, you name it. So we're kind of a full service firm. And really, I would say kind of hit our stride a little bit with COVID. We have a huge, if you go to the Fisher Phillips website, there's a free um, resource for you, all related to vaccines and to COVID-19, sample policies, et cetera, that you can access. And it's really just been there since the beginning to try to help people as much as we can. So what I want to talk about today and sort of the roadmap is sort of a quick discussion about, so how did we get here? Why are we even having this discussion? Sort of California's unique sort of take on everything related to Delta variant and what it's requiring of its employers and employees. And then just sort of the general question that I've seen routinely now is whether to mandate or whether to not mandate. What's the pros and cons? What things do I need to be thinking about? And then sort of we'll fold into that. OSHA is about to come out with another emergency temporary standard. We already had to deal with one OSHA emergency temporary standard, mostly related to sick time, but now it's going to be related to vaccines. And then also we have Biden's vaccine mandate, which applies to federal employees. And then what I'll show you is some recommended documents to make sure that you have ready to go. I'll show you sort of some samples if you need me to send some to you. I'm happy if you want to reach out to me. I'm happy to forward them on to you. But just we'll go through things that you need to make sure that you have in place. So when you are dealing with it, that you're not sort of caught flat-footed. So what got us here really, it looked like we were on a pretty good path for a little while until this Delta variant raised its ugly head. And it's had significant impacts on vaccine and mask mandates. So like I said, just when we thought things were going in the right direction, here it was. It fueled a surge of COVID-19 cases, leading to the CDC to come up with new masking guidance, statewide mandates, and a specter of further restrictions. Employers, I'm sure all of you know, are struggling with needing to operate and deal with hesitant workers who still haven't received any vaccine doses, and then those who are upset that there's people that don't have the vaccine. So how you sort of manage that. There's a renewed interest in seeing the vaccination rate at your workplace climb. So companies are understanding, and sort of when I first started counseling about vaccines, it was sort of early days when the vaccine, even before the vaccine came out, people knew that it was on the horizon and were trying to figure out how best to position themselves once it did come and what they were going to require of their employees. And I'd say the prevailing wisdom, prevailing response from employers, and then our counseling of employers was, don't mandate it, just recommend it. You're kind of save yourself a bunch of headaches that you wouldn't have to deal with otherwise. But then I would say there's been a marked shift since the Delta variant. And now I would say that I'm seeing more a trend of employers that are mandating the vaccine, simply because I think they want to impress upon their individuals that they're trying to make a strong stand and keep their workplace safe. And I think they see it as potential liability on their end if they're not taking those measures and making it so that they're allowing unvaccinated people to be in the workplace. So way back when in May, but we had some CDC guidance that the CDC reverses the May 13th guidance. The CDC announced that they now recommend that people in areas with substantial and high COVID-19 transmission should wear masks indoors, regardless of vaccination status. Most of the US is currently in a substantial or high transmission category, so they would fall into that CDC definition. And then why is that? Mostly because of this Delta variant. Again, it's uniquely different from prior virus strains. The CDC director also stressed that the vast majority of severe illness and death is among unvaccinated people. So she also indicated data shows a breakthrough infections can happen in 1 out of 10 vaccinated individuals. So Governor Newsom, California, took what the CDC was saying very seriously. Less than a day after that, they issued new masking guidance for fully vaccinated individuals in substantial or high transmission areas. The California Department of Public Health quickly followed suit by updating its guidance for the use of face coverings. Similar to the CDC, the California Department of Public Health's July 28th announcement recommends universal masking indoors statewide, regardless of vaccination status. And then in July 26th, we had sort of a new ramping up. So California then mandates a vaccine for healthcare workers. I'm sure we may have heard about this on the news. Governor Newsom announced that the state will require all healthcare workers and state employees to show proof of a COVID-19 vaccination or be subjected to weekly testing. First in the nation standard to work. So California was really the first. It was the first in the nation to require all state workers and workers in healthcare and high-risk congregate settings to either show proof of full vaccination or be tested once per week. Also, they encouraged all local government and other employers to adopt a similar protocol. So, really setting the tone, how California wanted to sort of handle this moving forward. They wanted to take the CDC at its word, and it wanted to make sure that it's taking this Delta variant very seriously. Then in August, it continues the trend, and California then ordered all teachers to be vaccinated or to submit to regular testing. Governor Newsom announced that teachers and other school employees must either be vaccinated or submit to regular testing, again, once per week. Again, it was first in the nation. No surprise, the teachers' union supported such a move. And then schools must be in compliance by October 15th, which is going to come up pretty quick. So how have employers responded? So we know how California now, it sort of took action on the domains that it controls, right? The healthcare workers, state employees, and then public school employees and schools. So how about private employers? What has been that trend? We took Fisher Phillips. We have a lot of employers that we represent. So we have the benefit of being able to give them surveys and ask them what they're doing so that we can kind of pass that information on. So our third survey that we conducted this year, we had over 700 employers respond. And while only 4% of the respondents indicated they would mandate or consider a mandate in May, that number jumped 15% in this most recent survey. The number of employers opposed to a mandate dropped by 15 points during the past 3 months, but it still remains high at 68%. And 79% of employers, which is up from 74%, are actively encouraging vaccination. So that's what I was saying. They're really, from the beginning until today, there's really been more of a push to mandate vaccines. That's become sort of a trend that we're seeing. More than 600 universities and schools are already mandating for students, and then just a number of large businesses, including some local businesses, these listed here, have also mandated. Okay, so what does it mean if you and your company are considering mandating the vaccine? What's that going to look like? So if you mandate, what you need to make sure that you do is you want to figure out the best way that you're going to communicate this policy to your employees, including how much notice to provide before implementing the requirement. Vaccines and masks have become such a hot, even political, just a hot social issue that everybody's been trying to grapple with. It's really created division and conflict in workplaces all across the country and the world, really. And so what you have to do is you want to make sure that you respect those differences. And so you want to give, if you're going to be mandating, you want to make sure that you give enough lead time to employees to either get the vaccine, obviously, but then also to kind of be ready for it. Like, you don't want to just drop it on them. You want to make sure that you give them a sufficient amount of notice. You want to consider related logistics, including compensation issues that may be implicated for the time spent traveling to and receiving the vaccine. So, it's my high recommendation, and you must pay for the time and travel. So, if you're a big company and you have lots of employees, that could really add up. But it's something that you want to make sure that you do. Otherwise, you could be on the hook for wage and hour, failure to compensate claims that you don't want to be on the other end of. You want to spend time considering how your employees and customers are likely to respond to the policy, including how you will handle pushback. Anticipate and prepare for certain levels and forms of anxiety and or resistance, and develop a designated vaccine team for coordinating this process. You want to not sort of be reactive, you want to be proactive. So you want to make sure that all of you are in agreement, you understand what your sort of lines are, how you're going to handle certain scenarios. Probably best to maybe rope in your favorite employment law attorney to try to come up with sort of talking points that you want to have with certain people who are pushing back. And it really depends on how they're pushing back. If they're pushing back because they just don't agree with it politically, or because they just won't even give you a reason, then that is a different conversation. And let's say they say, I have a medical reason and I can't take the vaccine, or my religion prohibits me from having this vaccine. Those are two very different conversations. And really, those are the only two major carve outs right now when you're having that conversation. If you want to mandate it, you can set timelines for either dismissal or termination, as long as you're consistent. But you want to make sure you work with those employees that state those two exceptions. You want to develop a robust and clear accommodation policy for employees entitled to exemption from required vaccines. So like I said, so due to an ADA covered disability or a sincerely held religious belief. So I'm sure you all have disability accommodation policies. You want to make sure that you incorporate in that discussion regarding vaccines and how that's to be handled. And just like any other disability, if somebody comes to you and says, I can't take this vaccine, you have to engage in the interactive process, as you would if anyone would come to you with any sort of disability. And it's really critical, and you want to make sure that you document it very well. And what an interactive process really is a fancy term for a conversation that you and the employee that's coming to you saying, no, I can't get the vaccine, and here's why, because I have a disability or because of this sincerely held religious belief. You want to sit down with them. You want to talk with them on an individualized and confidential basis. I always say that maybe you should have at least one other person in the room, and you should document your communication. So talk with them, consider what their job duties, their essential functions of their job are. Can they work from home? Can they do any other sort of activities or work that would allow them to maybe not be around other individuals or be in the workplace? If you say, no, there's absolutely nothing that we can do for this person, or if you just say that you just don't want to bother with it, the sort of only defense is it's an undue hardship to the company. But the undue hardship is always a high standard, and it always involves money. It's, what is it going to cost so much to this company that it's going to cripple it? And often sort of accommodations you may be able to make to certain individuals to give them their own space, or to make it so that they come in at different times, or if they're able to work from home, is doubtful that it's going to cripple the company. Also, factors are prevalence of vaccinated employees in the workplace, amount of customer contact, rate of vaccination in the community, amount of contact with others whose vaccination status is unknown. Those are all things that would kind of come into play when you would be doing this interactive process. And then also supervisor training is vital. You want to avoid inadvertent medical inquiries. We've always been sort of sacrosanct, right? You don't talk to people about their disabilities or their medical conditions. That's their private business, and you have to sort of tiptoe around what information you actually gather from them. The standing rule is you're only allowed to have information that is directly relevant to the essential functions that they'll be performing at the job. And here, all of a sudden, we're in this sort of realm of being able to talk to them about whether or not they've been vaccinated or not. The guidance says you're able to ask them that question, but that's kind of where it stops. You don't want to have sort of rogue supervisors out there sort of drilling them about why aren't they getting vaccinated? What's their issue? What medical condition do they possibly have that would make it so they don't get the vaccine? Like, you don't want those types of comments out there. So you want to make sure, just like you have your vaccine team kind of ready to go with sort of the standard lines, you want to make sure your supervisors are right there with you. You want to make sure that they understand the importance of not pushing those questions and making it so that they're trying to gather inadvertent medical information that could then potentially put the company and them at risk. And then, on the flip side, if you decide that you're a company that you don't want to mandate the vaccine, there's options for you too. Lots of people are flooded with disinformation about COVID, so you could go on an informational campaign. You could, others simply don't, you could, a lot of people are getting it from social media, news sources, words of mouth, and sometimes people just don't have the information. For example, many believe that they have to pay for the vaccine, even though a simple internet search will show that they don't. You want to address specific questions, concerns, or misconceptions among vaccination skeptics in your workforce. An example, you want to emphasize that although the vaccine isn't 100% effective, it is still the best defense against serious illness, hospitalization, and death. You don't want to obviously turn into an armchair doctor or somebody that, don't want to sort of go out of your lane necessarily, but you want to really stress to them the importance of the vaccine and keeping this company safe, and that it's your role to make sure that all employees there are safe, and that's sort of been the company's decision, is to make it so that they think that it's really important that everybody should have it. So it's just more of a recommendation to them, and then to try to give them the facts about why you've made that decision or why you support it. Can we incentivize? And I've heard that from people. We hear in the news that people can win lottery tickets and all sorts of other things to try to get people to get vaccinated. And so can companies incentivize? Yes, but I would do it very carefully. You still will have the same accommodation obligations for medical or religious reasons. If an incentive is too high, it could be considered involuntary, meaning that the people felt coerced to do it, that the bonus, that the carrot at the end of the stick was too great, that they were coerced into doing it, which would then make it a wellness program, and wellness program rules are violated if employees are forced to disclose protected medical information. So you'd be on the hook for that. A de minimis incentive would be okay, like a water bottle or a modest gift card of likely $25 or less. Then there's potential regular rate issues, which would come in because you would have arguably a bonus there, which would need to be factored in for overtime. And then you've got California COVID sick leave all in the mix. So, it's just one of those. If you want to do it, I would for sure check in with your favorite employment law attorney and make sure that whatever incentives that you have in place really pass muster, because it's, it could be a potential issue moving forward. And then, like we said, can you ask about vaccination status? Last year, the EEOC issued guidance making it clear that you could, and it's not an inquiry that violates the ADA. However, the ADA prohibits employers from asking job applicants prior to making a conditional offer of employment. In May, the EEOC further clarified that inquiring about vaccine status or requesting proof of vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry under the ADA, but always be careful not to ask any further information. Just as you don't want your supervisor to ask any questions, you don't want to be doing it either in the hiring phase or in any other phase. Now, what if an employee declines or refuses to be vaccinated, wear a mask, disclose vaccination status? We all know those employees, right? So when that happens, you just have to be really careful. employees who refuse to disclose their status, so they're not going to tell you one way or the other whether or not they're vaccinated. They need to be treated as unvaccinated, pure and simple. You want to remind them of the legitimate purpose and the potential implications, and why the company is encouraging people to get vaccinated. And then, if you sort of draw a hard line, this is kind of in the bucket of, if you are recommending it, but let's say you're mandating it, and you tell everybody, okay, by such and such date, you need to be fully vaccinated, and somebody comes to you and they say, and this actually happened in a case that I have right now, they came to their hiring manager and said, well, my fiance, my in-laws, they don't believe in the vaccine, and I don't want to make them mad, so I'm not going to get the vaccine. And so the company said, well, okay, well, by that end date, then you're no longer employed by here. And that was okay. They were able to make that call so long as they treated everybody the same, they disciplined the same. You just want to make sure, if you're doing that, that you act uniformly. You don't want anyone to be treated differently by doing the same acts, and then to be able to come back and say it's because I'm over 40, or it's because I'm a woman, or it's because I have this religion, whatever it may be. You want everybody to and that really helps with your managers if they understand what the line is there, so that everybody's treated the same. Now, this has been sort of in the news here, this OSHA's emergency temporary standard and the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. So this is the OSHA's emergency temporary standard hasn't officially come out yet, but it's in the works. It's supposed to come out in the next couple days, but I've sat in on several calls where they have sort of forecast what they think is going to be in there. And then the COVID-19 vaccine mandate, what we do know and what's actively happening. So the path out of the pandemic is what this is being called. And it was President Biden's 6-pronged strategy to combat COVID-19. So it includes vaccine mandates for federal contractors and many healthcare workers. It requires all employers with 100 or more employees to ensure their employees are vaccinated or tested weekly. And it requires employers to provide paid time off to get vaccinated. Biden's plan involves OSHA is issuing a vaccine testing rule that will apply to all private employers with more than 100 employees. This vaccine mandate is very large. It's estimated to impact 80 million workers, or 2/3 of the country's workforce. This rule will take the format of an emergency temporary standard. So like I said, we already had one of these by OSHA, which was dealing with COVID and sick leave, but now it's related to vaccines. It allows the agency, OSHA, to enact regulations that can enforce immediately if a grave danger to a worker's safety is present. And like I said, they're behind closed doors drafting this as we speak. Covered employers who ignore the standard could face OSHA citations and penalties of up to $14,000 per violation. So who's going to be covered by this looming OSHA mandate? All employers covered by the OSHA Act must comply with the forthcoming ETS. That would include many office-based employers who do not regularly interact with OSHA, such as financial institutions, insurance companies, law firms, other professional and technical work environments. And when will it be issued? Like I said, on one of the recent calls I listened to, they indicated that it will be released in a matter of weeks. OSHA officials have also urged businesses to voluntarily begin the process of adopting vaccination mandates without waiting for the agency to kind of get ahead of the curve a little bit. Once issued, the ETS will have immediate effect in the 29 states where federal OSHA has jurisdiction, of which California is one. The ETS can remain in place for 6 months before it must be replaced by a permanent OSHA standard. So, it's best practice to kind of be getting yourself ready for this, simply because once they put the green light on it, it's going to be immediate. So you're going to have to really be in compliance all of a sudden. There's state-planned states and states where the federal government does not have jurisdiction over workplaces safety. The state agencies will have to adopt the ETS or just as effective measures within 15 to 30 days. So really, even if you're not governed by federal OSHA, you're gonna have the same plan in place anyway. Governors of some state plan states have already come out against the ETS, which could set up a battle between state plan agencies and then the federal OSHA. So, okay, so here's some unanswered questions that hopefully will be clarified once the ETS comes out. One of them was, will remote employees be covered? They kind of went back and forth on that with the prior ETS. So according to comments from OSHA on Friday, the ETS will not apply to employees who never come to work. But if the employee ever comes to work or works outside of the office with others, they will be covered. Another question is, all right, so how do you count this 100 employee threshold? Like here we have one location where we don't have 100. Does that mean that we're all right? While it's not clear in President Biden's announcement on Friday, OSHA officials suggested that the threshold will likely be the total number of employees rather than employees at each work site. So total number of employees that a company has. Also unclear is how the joint employer analysis will factor in. So let's say you have a company that then also has like a PEO or some other joint employer. Do you total all of those employees up? It's a little bit unclear to see if you would get to the 100 threshold. Will employers be required to collect proof of vaccination? Again, sort of unclear at this time, but it's my recommendation that you do, that you make sure that if your employees say that they're vaccinated, that you ask for a copy of their vaccination card. OSHA and sort of dovetailing there is OSHA requires record retention for length of employment plus 30 years. They're one of the longest statutes of limitation and require the longest amount of time for you to have to maintain those records. So could have huge record keeping implications. I mean, what companies have the same sort of filing system or even issues of maintaining records 30 years down the road, but that's going to be something that's going to be required. What type of testing will be required? Again, it's unclear at this time. While the PCR test is more accurate, it takes longer to receive the results and it's more expensive. And then who's going to pay for all this testing? Again, unclear at this time. Insurance may cover the costs of tests, and several states have laws predating COVID-19 requiring employers to pay for mandatory medical tests or reimburse employees for any such testing. What I recommend that you do is to look at your employer plans and to see what the requirements are or what you have set up for your employees. And sort of to go back on that, I would default on paying right now. And here's the question: must employers pay employees for time spent getting tested? There's again no clear answer. The safest is to pay for the time. So the safest would be to pay for the time and then to pay for the testing until there's some clear rule. OSHA commented Friday that employer will be required to provide paid time off or use of existing PTO. Generally, the time spent by employees receiving employer-required tests should be treated as compensable if the testing is required during the workday or if necessary to perform the job safely and effectively. Makes sense. Will unionized employers be required to bargain over the decision of how to comply with the ETS? And this is always a hot question whenever we're dealing with unions. It's unclear as to what extent unionized employers will be compelled to bargain over the decision on how to comply with the ETS, or at least the discretionary aspects with respect to vaccines versus weekly testing. At a minimum, be prepared to bargain over the effects of compliance with the ETS. Non-union employers should consider the practical implications of compliance from a labor relations perspective. So, even though a lot of times employers sort of dismiss or don't consider union type questions, but really it's smart to, because it just really kind of helps drive or protect you from actions that could be perceived as unfair or mistreated by your employees, that they're being mistreated. Will the ETS face legal challenges? Most likely, all of these have, and most of them have lost. A lot of time, not this one in particular, but most of the time where OSHA or has tried to, and some people argue overstep its authority to try to make it so that people were safe, that the courts stood by OSHA. That they, I think people are looking at this as really sort of an unprecedented. How many times we heard it's unprecedented times, and I think that the courts look at it that way too. That it's sort of important, and they rely on, like it was a few slides back about OSHA's authority to step in, sort of in these sort of grave situations, and that's what they're doing. Governors of many states have already indicated that they intend to challenge this ETS. Courts may block enforcement of the emergency rule or parts of the rule until legal challenges are resolved. OSHA will have to prove that there is a grave danger to workers, but employers should not count on being relieved of all obligations and should prepare now. So just even though OSHA might be getting beat up a little bit out there, it's just important that you continue to do what you're supposed to do under the ETS so that you don't get, so if it's found that OSHA was in the right, that you're not then caught not having complied. So what should you do? You need to make sure that you adopt procedures for determining employees' vaccination status. So these are sort of the proactive steps. You need to maintain confidential records of employee vaccination status. I would treat it as you would any other private medical record. EEOC has indicated it's lawful to ask employees about COVID-19 vaccination status, but this should end your inquiry, as we said. The ETS may require that you collect proof of vaccination, otherwise create a confidential list of vaccinated workers, review state laws regarding confidentiality and privacy of medical records. Next, you want to determine if you will mandate the vaccine or allow unvaccinated employees to be tested weekly. For some employers, collecting and tracking weekly test results may burden them such that they decide to adopt a mandatory vaccination policy. That's one of the silver linings of a mandatory vaccination policy is it's absolute. You don't have to bother making sure people are getting tested weekly. OSHA officials stated that employers may require vaccinations without providing the alternative for weekly testing, subject to those accommodations that we talked about. If planning for weekly testing, think through the logistics. Is it going to be on site through a designated vendor? Are you going to pay for it? Are you going to pay at the time of testing? Or are they going to have to pay for it and get reimbursed? You just want to make sure that you've really thought through all those questions and you have answers for them. You want to make sure that you have a plan for addressing non-compliance by employees. So like we said, if you have those rogue people that are like, I'm not going to wear my mask or I'm not going to be vaccinated, you want to make sure that you have a plan. What happens to an employee who does not get tested? What happens to an employee who refuses to get vaccinated? You want to have a set protocol in place. You want to develop a plan for handling accommodation requests. Employees may request accommodations for disabilities or for religious reasons under federal or state laws. You need to make sure you develop a robust and clear, reasonable accommodation policy that addresses these issues. You need to communicate and administer the accommodation process thoughtfully, emphasizing individualized, confidential consideration of each request. And be prepared for employees to request an accommodation from the weekly testing requirement. It's the documentation is really the key part of this. You want to, down the road, if somebody comes back and sues you and says, they failed to engage in the interactive process, they failed to accommodate my reasonable request. You want to be able to show that you were able to, that you did, and all the documentation. You want to say who was in the room, what was discussed. Send memorializing emails, put letters on the file, like make sure that you are documenting everything that was discussed so that you can make sure that, let's say the worst happens and they do sue you down the road, that you're able to show all of that. So often these issues go to trial and there aren't documents showing that certain actions happened. I'll tell you, juries, it's as if it never happened. Juries need documents. And if you don't have them, then they'll just assume that you're either not telling the truth or what have you. So you want to make sure that you have whatever you can documented. You also want to have a plan for tracking test results. You should have a plan in place for collecting and tracking test results. Who's going to collect the results? When will the test results need to be collected? And how will you track the results? Just want to make sure that you've thought through all those questions. You want to make sure that you prepare for OSHA complaints and inspections. I will tell you that the Biden administration pumped a lot of money and resources into OSHA, increased the number of OSHA officers, and the number of complaints have skyrocketed since this whole COVID pandemic. And they're taking them much more. I mean, since there's more people, they're able to address them more completely, and there's been a lot more people in inspections of workplaces. So just be ready. The vaccination ETS will not displace current compliance duties related to COVID-19 prevention and mitigation. OSHA will likely ask you for your COVID-19 response plan and training records. So if you haven't already updated your injury and illness prevention plan to include COVID-19 responses, you want to make sure that you do that stat. You want to develop a COVID-19, and if you don't know what any of that is, what I just said, if you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to sort of tell you what all that is. But essentially what it is every company needs to have an injury and illness prevention plan. And then there's requirements now that you need to specifically call out your plan under COVID and have it detailed in there. And if OSHA comes sniffing around, you want to be able to hand it to them, or else you're not in compliance. And my firm's put together that plan that you could then just give them, but you have to either reach out to me, or I can point you to somebody who can help. Develop a COVID-19 policy and communicate its requirements to your employees. Train managers and supervisors on what to do and say if OSHA arrives for an inspection. And often they're unannounced, so you want to make sure you're ready ahead of time. The Department of Labor comments. OSHA and the Department of Labor held virtual meetings last Friday. OSHA indicated that it will not conduct any further listening sessions with outside groups, citing the severe time crunch they're under to complete this ETS. Businesses, unions will be allowed to submit comments after the standard takes effect. And the Department of Labor indicated they have not decided whether employers will be required to cover the cost of testing. And then we just received guidance this week regarding federal contractors. So there's a new executive order goes beyond those working on federal property. It's effective with contracts with pending solicitations, extensions, renewals, and on or before October 15th. So what do we learn about this new federal contractor mandate, if that applies to any of you? The vaccine mandate requires full vaccination for all employees of covered federal contractors by December 8th, with those same limited exceptions of disability or religious accommodations. Employees must show proof of vaccination, mask and social distancing requirements at covered contractor work sites, including for employees, visitors, and others, and a requirement that contractors designate a person or persons to coordinate COVID-19 workplace safety efforts at their workplace. For the federal contractors, is testing still allowed? Can you still have that sort of, well, if they don't get tested, they can, or if they don't, they can get tested? No, the guidance mandates testing in lieu of providing vaccination status, unless the individual, again, is entitled to an accommodation for a disability or a sincerely held religious belief. Regular testing may be a reasonable accommodation for them, but not for others that don't have either of those accommodations. Which federal contractors are covered? So not all federal contractors are covered. In order to be covered, the contract or a contract-like instrument must be performed in the U.S. in whole or in part. And it must be one of those four types. So procurement contract, contract for services under the Service Contract Act, concessions contract, contract in connection with federal contracts, or land offering services. And then also recipients of Medicare and Medicaid, they also now are having mandate issues. CMS will issue temporary regulations. The scope for those mandates is broad. And many healthcare providers will also be covered by OSHA and ETS, so there'll be an overlap anyway. And when I talk about documents that you should make sure that you have ready, here's just sort of some snippets of some documents that I have. If you would like, I'm happy to send them to you. But we have a sample of vaccination policy for one where the company is not mandating vaccines. And then there's, obviously you want to have a sample vaccination policy if you are mandating it. You want to, like I said during the presentation, you want to make sure that you have an accommodation procedure that's really clear. So when employees come in and they know that they are either requesting accommodation for a disability or a religious reason, that you have the procedure ready for them. And then you have the forms to be able to give them to fill out to give you the specifics. And then, like for example, a request for medical exemption, you would have a specific form. And then a request for religious exemption, you have a specific form. And then that person could fill it out, and then you could keep that in their file so that you would make sure that you maintain it. And that's it. So if you have any questions, here's my email address too. It's pnagle@fisherphillips.com. And so if at any time you want to reach out and have questions, or if you are interested in any of the documents that I referenced, let me know and I can help send them over to you. So I hope that made sense. It's a lot of information, and we will be receiving more and more as the ETS gets rolled out, and maybe we'll have a part 2 where I can tell you about that. But I think OSHA's done a pretty good job of trying to forecast where it's going to be, and Biden's plan to let us know who is going to be wrapped into it. So we have some idea. But I really appreciate the time, and thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Patrice. Are there any questions from the group? I had one question. I don't know if you have an answer for this, but with the accommodations that exist, if people tend to opt towards that versus getting vaccinated because that is an option, and people just don't get vaccinated, like could they potentially change that policy, or like how could that affect anything? I'm just wondering, because people might say, hey, if you're not going to let me get tested every week and I only get vaccinated, I'll just file for an accommodation. You get that approved, I'm good.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some misuse of those accommodations. And, I think that you really just sort of have to use your sense about it. And, as an employer, I think that you have to, a lot of times with the medical or disability type reason, you could ask for a doctor's note or some sort of confirmation of that. And then with the religious exemption, is that what you're saying? Or
Yeah.
That's the stickier one. I mean, that's just one where you kind of have to just rely on what they share with you. But yeah, there's going to be some abuse of the system, of course. But I think, to have a policy that was draconian and said that those carve-outs weren't there wouldn't be workable either. So, I think it's just one of those things.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, I know we'll try to do these earlier. I think you had mentioned recommendation of a lunch and learn, just so that it's not towards the end of the day. So that's something we can definitely work on if there's a follow-up or other information just that you would need to provide for the community. But really appreciate your time. I appreciate the community for staying late this evening, and this will be recorded, so we'll send that out. But thank you all very much.